He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
The entire floor had sort of erupted and bunks were wrecked and so on. And Fernando had a cabin just right close to that and presumably got trapped once the second bomb went off and the water would have cascaded down through the stairs and caught him there.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mulligan and this is Crimes NZ. In this episode, we're looking into the 1985 bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. It's described as the first act of terrorism against New Zealand, and Greenpeace photographer Fernando Pereira was killed in the blast. David Roby is a professor of journalism at AUT and wrote a book about the final voyage of the Rainbow Warrior, a voyage he took part in.
Well, it was the last voyage of the original Rainbow Warrior. Of course, the two others followed, Jesse. But the reason why I was on board, because I wasn't actually a member of Greenpeace or anything like that, although I've been an environmental journalist for many years. And at the time, I was very involved in reporting environmental issues around the Pacific. And in those days, Greenpeace was very small. I mean, it was a very fledgling organisation. They had a little office in Nagle House, downtown Auckland, and Elaine Shaw was the coordinator. And she was very worried that this was going to be quite a threshold voyage. It was probably the first campaign by Greenpeace that was humanitarian, as not only environmental, to rescue basically people who have been suffering from nuclear radiation on Rongelap Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And this had been planned for many months, in fact a couple of years or so. And Elaine was very keen to get some coverage in the media in the Southern Hemisphere. And there were about 6 journalists that went on board, but I ended up being the only one from the Southern Hemisphere. It was a big commitment at the time because I was a freelance journalist and it meant joining the Rainbow Warrior in Hawaii and being on board for 10 to 11 weeks, right up until the time of the bombing.
Can you describe the ship?
Well, it was quite different from the sort of ultra-modern environmental ship they have now as Greenpeace 3. It was an old fishing trawler, about 47 metres or so. The original name was Sir William Hardy. It was built in Scotland and Aberdeen, and after a life as a fishing trawler, it became a research ship, and then it was sort of up on the market. And David McTaggart, who was then head of Greenpeace, bought it for about £40,000. And it was refitted over in the UK. But before this voyage that I joined, well, of course, had been refitted in Jacksonville in the US as a combined motor-driven ship and a sailing ship. So it was quite innovative at the time.
Comfortable to stay on?
Well, I mean, I found it, to be on board for all that time, I actually really enjoyed it. And it certainly was, compared with the comforts today and Greenpeace, on Rainbow Warrior 3, it was pretty rough, but no, it was actually a lot of character, and it was a lovely ship in many respects, and I guess all of us on board grew to love it incredibly.
It was the US government testing around the Marshall Islands, 67 nuclear tests on several small islands, several atolls, but then, of course, the French were doing similar sorts of testing, and were they the next target for Greenpeace?
Yes, well, this was supposed to be like a combined mission. First of all, rescue the people in Rongelap, and then carry on the next stage of the campaign, going to Mororoa and taking on the French with the nuclear testing there. And of course, the French, over a period of time until they actually sort of stopped testing in 1996, they carried out about 193 tests in the Pacific, and 43 of those were atmospheric. So for our part of the world, probably it was even greater affront to the region. I wasn't actually planning to go on board that next stage. I mean, once, because I'm freelance, I earn a biscuit. Mm-hmm. So I planned to sort of leave the ship in Auckland anyway when we arrived back.
So it was stopping off in Auckland on the way to Mururoa.
That's right, and refitting and preparing for that next stage of the protest.
And to set the scene, younger listeners might not realise that there was already a bit of tension between New Zealand and France in the early 80s. This is our Prime Minister at the time, David Lange, talking about France using the South Pacific, our backyard, to test their weapons.
There were really three questions. Will the French persist in a nuclear testing program? Secondly, if they do, will they do it near us and keep the united opposition of the Pacific against them? Or will they go and do it in their own backyard? Now, I don't want them to test it all. If they must, I don't want them in the Pacific. From the report from Mururoa, there are geological structures in France which have the strength or greater than the strength of Mururoa. It is not a question of geological structure. It is a question of arrogance. It is a question of national pride, and it is simply a whole philosophy built up where they have chosen for donkey's years to inflict their weapons testing on other people for their defence, and that's unacceptable. But I think we need now to go over to Europe and in France, start to say something to the socialists who made the promises before election and back down on them afterwards, and tell them what we think of that. Point out to the French people that they can now look forward to having these tests, which they say are so vital, in their own home, and then we'll see whether they think the whole deterrent program for France is so vital.
Actually, the way he's talking there, I wonder if he was still leader of the opposition. In 1984, that would have been long. I don't know if it was pre or post-election, but anyway.
Well, the word I pick up there is arrogance, and I mean that's been the history right through for all those years that the nuclear testing was carried on. We have to remember that France got kicked out of nuclear testing in the Sahara Desert prior to the Pacific. With the War of Independence in Algeria, it became untenable for France to carry on its nuclear tests. I think they carried out about 17 there in the desert. So they had to hunt around for another place. There was never any debate, serious debate or anything like that about, or any question if it would be in its own backyard, even as David Longy had said at the time, you know, that geologically there's no reason why not. No, politically it was very expedient to have it as far away as possible from France. And by and large in the debate in France, it was always seen as part of the force de frappe, the nuclear deterrent that France needed as an independent weapon sort of thing.
So take us then the following year to July 10th, 1985. What happened that night?
Well, that was the bombing on board the Rainbow Warrior and caught the country totally in shock, and also the crew of the Rainbow Warrior and Greenpeace generally. Initially, it was sort of the big questions were asked, well, who could have been responsible for this atrocious, outrageous attack on a peaceful environmental ship sitting here in Auckland.
Can you just take us to the night, by the way, because I think there's a birthday party or something.
That's right, Steve Sawyer. Basically, you had Peter Wilcox was the skipper on board, and with Greenpeace campaigns, they always had a campaign coordinator as well, who basically organised all the strategies and so on, collectively, of course. So Steve Sawyer was the campaign coordinator for the Marshall Islands and then also going on to Mururoa. So it was his birthday that night. That was 3 nights or 3 days after we arrived back in Auckland. So that's when the attack happened. And I think it's an incredible miracle that only one person lost his life, Fernando Pereira.
So you were at the party?
I wasn't there that night because I had already been on board for 10.5 weeks, and I was very keen to sort of be on shore for a while. So I was home that night. I tried to organise a scout trip for my 8-year-old son and 4-year-old earlier on that evening, and that never eventuated. It was probably a good thing anyway that hadn't happened. But no, so I wasn't actually on board. I joined the crew early in the morning when I heard what had happened.
So there were a few on board when the first explosion took place?
Oh, yeah. And everybody scurried to try and get off, including Fernando, because Fernando went back on board to grab his camera and gear and so on. And I just think it's staggering. I mean, because a lot of the media coverage at the time focused on, well, as the story unveiled further on down the track, the idea was that, well, it was never meant to be any loss of life. It was an outrageous act of terrorism. terrorism. The bombers knew very well, because they were getting information all the time, that there was a large crowd on board the Rainbow Warrior that night, and the chances were very high that there could have been a loss of life. I think it's quite extraordinary that, for example, Bunny and Hanker, two of the crew members, were in a cabin immediately above the engine room where the first bomb went off. The second was close to the propeller shaft to make sure, that the ship would never really sail again, sort of thing.
By the way, where is Marston Wharf?
Oh, just down here off Auckland, right in the harbour there.
So real central city.
Yeah, right in the heart.
Yeah,
exactly. Further over from there. I had a cabin on board down below, just near Fernando's. It was a very narrow stairway down to the aft cabins. And I had the opportunity of going back on board the Rainbow Warrior some weeks later when it was refloated and taken over to Devonport Naval Base. So I was able to see all the damage that had been created. And I was quite staggered. My own cabin, the entire floor had sort of erupted and bunks were wrecked and so on. And Fernando had a cabin just right close to that and presumably got trapped once the second bomb went off and the water would have cascaded down through the stairs and caught him there.
Let's go to the morning after the bombing then, and this is how it was covered here on RNZ on Morning Report.
Explosions rang out from the 40-metre ship at about midnight, and the crew scrambled to get off the vessel to safety as she began going under. But one crew member was caught below decks, and police recovered his body early this morning. Stunned Greenpeace members say the vessel was priceless, but right now they're still mourning for their dead colleague who went down with the vessel.
All we know was that between the first and second explosions, he went back aboard, presumably to retrieve his camera gear, and he never made it out.
Rainbow Warrior didn't go to a warrior's death. She sank in her sleep just after midnight, tied up at an Auckland wharf. It's a tragic end to what was probably the world's #1 peace vessel, small as she was. What blew her up and killed a man of peace?
Say half of the world leaders of Greenpeace are in New Zealand at the moment.
So the one big question mark in your mind at the moment is
what happened on the boat last night. Was it an accident or was it not an accident?
We know now, of course, that it wasn't an accident. I'm talking to David Roby with memories of 1985 when the Rainbow Warrior, the Greenpeace ship, was bombed here in New Zealand. What did we find out about how the French planned and executed this mission?
Well, basically it's a campaign called Operation Satanique. It was basically 13 secret operatives, agents, were operating from the DGSE in the country at the time. Two teams, one that brought the explosives, the other one that was going to plant the explosives, and there was a third team for fail-safe in case anything went wrong with the first two teams. Then there was a commanding officer who kept an overview of the whole operation. And I think there was an element of arrogance. It's the same as the arrogance about the nuclear testing itself. There was extraordinary arrogance about, taking on an operation like this in a peaceful country. We were certainly an ally of France at the time, and basically assuming that they could get away with this outrageous act.
And eventually, how many agents were involved in total?
About 13, and three spread over the three groups.
And two were caught?
Two were caught. With a little bit of more luck, they might have actually got more. But you have to sort of see it in the context of the period, of the time. New Zealand was unpopular with the major nuclear powers and so on. And there was certainly no sympathy for New Zealand's position about nuclear testing. So there wasn't really any kind of cooperation, even from our neighbour Australia, because had we had more cooperation from Australian authorities and so on, we probably would have got agents that were on board the Uvea yacht to carry the explosives, and they were in Norfolk Island. But it was extraordinary that we got two anyway. Mafar and Pierre, they were the two that were caught.
Yeah, that might answer the question about why we weren't warned about the bombing, why we didn't get any message or clue that it was going to happen.
Well, I think that's, personally, that's something I've really wondered about for all those years, with our so-called close liaisons that we have, intelligence, and now, of course, New Zealand being part of Five Eyes and that sort of thing. We did not benefit in any way from intelligence because really the police were operating from the base of never an experience with terrorism of this scale, certainly state terrorism. And I'm sure the SAS and our intelligence networks and so on had a lot more information, and that a certain amount leaked out at the time that they had more information than probably the police could possibly have at that time. So I think we're very much let down by our intelligence community.
Let's go to the arrest then of Dominic Prieur and Elaine Marfar. Here's Ray Wilmot from what was known at the time as 1ZB.
A quite incredible scene at the back of the High Court in Auckland as a senior police officer cleared a path and a small convoy of 2 police cars and the enclosed prisoners' truck swept into the driveway at quite high speed. TV crews, reporters and photographers flung themselves into their pre-selected vantage points up trees and over walls as the police slammed the iron gate shut behind the convoy. The cameras poked down into the small yard and amid cries of, "I was here first," photographers threw themselves to the ground to try and poke their lenses under the gates to see if they could get shots of the French couple arriving. I don't think they were successful.
So any contrition from the French government?
Well, it took a long time, and of course, they had to pay they did pay a compensation with a lot of strong negotiation that went on for both New Zealand government and also Greenpeace. But justice was never really served. With the case, for example, that originally both Marfar and Prieur were charged with murder and arson and so on. And then with the extraordinary scenes that we've just heard at court, basically they pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. And of course, they were sentenced to 10 years and 7 years for the damage to Greenpeace itself. But this is a terrible result of this lack of justice in a sense that the 10 years were never served. Both Marfar and Prieur was part of the negotiations that went on with the French government. Basically, France had New Zealand over a barrel over trade and the European Union and so on. So compromises were done. And so eventually Marfar and Prieur were handed over to France for 3 years, essentially house arrest on Hao Atoll, which was the rear base of the French nuclear operations in Polynesia. Many would describe it as...
So hang on. So France sends 13 agents to New Zealand to commit an act of terrorism on New Zealand soil. We catch 2 of the 13, sentence them to 10 years in jail, and then France blackmails us with trade as a bargaining
exactly
chip.
Blackmail.
In order to get these agents back to France,
and so
where they spent 3 years on an island.
Well, they didn't even spend 3 years there. I mean, anybody would describe it as like a military club med. But they didn't spend 3 years there. There are excuses found. For example, Marfar, they created a false identity and smuggled them out of Tahiti back to France. And Prieur became pregnant and she went back to France, so well within their 3-year periods they were supposed to serve. And then, of course, they both wrote books, lauding their achievements, so-called achievements, It's outrageous, really.
Here's Greenpeace Captain Peter Wilcox describing how it feels even now, many years later, about the French government's response to their protest. And he sums it up pretty succinctly, probably how many people felt about the revelation. This is him talking to TVNZ's Sunday program in 2016.
So completely shocked. I mean, how could we, a bunch of hippies on an old steel trawler, scare a superpower so much they would set out to murder us? What possibly could we have done? We were speaking truth to power. That was about it. Is that really what scared them so badly?
Do you remember how you felt at the time?
Angry, upset, and deeply shocked, actually. As a journalist working in the Pacific, I put it in the context of what was already happening in the Pacific, where France, during the 80s, had been responsible for repression in New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Tahiti, and there'd been assassinations by military forces and so on of independence leaders like Ilo Masharo and so on. So when you put it all in the wider context of geopolitics and France's interests in the region, you start to understand. Because if you just look at the Rainbow Warrior alone, you think, how crazy? How could a nation do that? Against one of its friends. But when you see it, it was a part of a pattern at the time.
Jean-Luc Custer was the name of one of the agents who actually planted the bomb. And he did an interview also with TVNZ's Sunday program about their mission. And he talks in this clip about how it was never their intention to harm anybody. Have a listen to this.
We were not cold-blooded killers. We did everything to preserve the life of the people on board of the Rainbow Warrior.
Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe it for a moment. No, I have to say, I lived in France for many years, and I love France, and I worked for a French news agency and so on. But it's a wonderful country, but in terms of politics in the South Pacific and how it treated New Zealand at that time were just simply abhorrent. I think it was quite extraordinary, though, that statement was made by Kester. He was saying it for form, really. But it is extraordinary that a military officer of his background and so on would even come out publicly and speak about it. So I guess we can give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt that it must have played on his conscience over the years. I hope it did.
So what's been the long-lasting impact of the bombing here in New Zealand?
Well, I think it was a baptism of fire, a loss of innocence when that happened, and in the context that we had stood up as a small nation on being nuclear free, something we should have been absolutely proud of, which we were, of all those who basically campaigned for that at the time. And I think that really established our independence, if you like, as a small nation. And I think we have a lot to contribute to the world in terms of peacemaking and so on. And we shouldn't lose track of that the courage that was shown by this country standing up to a major nuclear power and all those others that wouldn't actually come out and challenge and question it. We should follow through on that sort of independence of thought. We should be a leader in terms of peace and nuclear-free throughout the world, because we now have a period where during the Cold War period with the United States and Soviet conflict, we're now replacing that with US and China. And so once again, there is that growing risk of a nuclear war.
The Rainbow Warrior itself is now off Matauri Bay in Northland as a diving attraction. Is that a fitting resting place, do you think?
There's a lot of controversy about the time, but ultimately I see it as very much a contribution to the environment, and certainly much better than just a memorial or something like that,
Lovely to have you in. Thanks for sharing your insights. We're going to finish with a clip from a documentary that you made, and it features music composed by a string band in Vanuatu. Do you know the piece?
Yes, great.
Okay, it's called No More Bombs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jesse.
David Roby, thanks so much.
No more bombs, no more bombs. Please don't stop.
You've been listening to Crimes NZ with me, Jesse Mulligan. You can find more episodes on the RNZ website, or we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find your podcasts. And once you've finished binging this series, you might like to try Untold Pacific History or the New Zealand Wars series for your regular history fix.